This is the Business of Government Hour, a conversation about leadership and management with government executives and thought leaders who are truly changing the way government does business. Welcome to a special edition of the Business of Government Hour, Leaders Speak on Thriving on Disruption. I'm Michael Keegan, your host and leadership fellow at the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Events over the last couple of years have put a renewed emphasis on the importance of being resilient. Leaders and organizations have been walloped by the unforgiving realities of disruption and uncertainty. Often when responding to the unforeseen, doing all we can to operate, meeting expectations, following through on commitments, and delivering on mission, there is little time to reflect, take stock, or even gain perspective. When faced with the unexpected, reflex and instinct seem to be what leaders and organizations alike rely on to weather the turbulence. Though these may serve as core components of a solid foundation, they are most certainly not enough. How can we make sense of a complex, nonlinear, and unpredictable world? What tools, frameworks, and insights can help leaders turn uncertainty into opportunity? And how do we rise above resiliency and adaptability to actually thrive on disruption? I'll explore these questions and so much more with my very special guest, Roger Spitz, chairman of the Disruptive Futures Institute and co-author of The Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption, a collection of 4 volumes. Roger, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Wonderful to be with you, Michael, and thank you for hosting me.
So, Roger, how can we make sense of a complex, nonlinear, and ever increasingly unpredictable world? And to that end, would you define for us systematic disruption and sort of deconstruct how it continually evolves?
Sure. So there are a few elements to unpack. And I think the first element to make sense of this kind of complex world and unpredictable is really to do with assumptions and not to assume that the world is stable, linear, and predictable. But we'll come on to that. But that's really the starting point, is reframing how we perceive the world and what is the true reality of the world. In terms of what we call systemic disruption, we can take a step back. I think we have 2 notable kind of evolutions with disruption. Joseph Schumpeter coined creative disruption, and we call that disruption 1.0. It's the industrial mutation which destroys old paradigms. One example that he gives is very much, after different wars, 1950s, reconstruction of certain countries in Europe. That is effectively a phenomenon of creative destruction, actually, to use Schumpeter's terms. The most famous one in terms of what disruption is, and that's what probably 99% of the world perceives as disruption, is the Silicon Valley or the technology or Clayton Christensen definition, which is disruptive innovation. And here there's specific characteristics in terms of how an innovative product might typically be disrupting an old market. And for us, we label this disruption 2.0. Now, for disruption 3.0, it's systemic, it's omnipresent. In other words, disruption is a constant. It establishes new paradigms, and to your point, these paradigms will evolve. So it's no longer a single event, but it's a steady state, which is increasing in its impact and which has spillovers, which can ricochet and turn into something else. So that for us is what we call systemic disruption. And the important takeaway, and to answer your question as to how it evolves, is that there's an increasing cost of relying on the assumptions of business as usual. In other words, there's a rising cost of assuming that the world is predictable. And that's because there's an inverse relationship between predictability and uncertainty. So the greater the uncertainty, the harder it is to predict, the more unknown variables. And that is really the big challenge, is that assumption of reliance on business as usual. And just quickly to wrap up on that question, how does it evolve and how do you kind of think about it? That's where you need to appreciate that the singular focus of isolated or discrete disruption or specific outcomes or fixed outcomes is a wrong way of thinking about it. We need to think about constant possible evolutions, and that's where thinking about multiple futures and scenarios and or what we call foresight in futures fields, That's where you're looking at the next order implications and the multiplicity of possibilities and how to think about those.
That's terrific. Good context, wonderful historical context as well. Roger, you point out that disruption is a significant change as we understand it, but you also acknowledge that it is not inherently good or bad. Could you elaborate on that perspective? And you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but how can we drive disruption ourselves and harness it as a power to thrive instead of, like, say, crumble?
Yeah, that's key, because for me, one of the aspects we try and focus on at the Disruptive Futures Institute is one of agency. In other words, we want to move from this idea of a victim mindset to one of being response able. In other words, having the agency to reduce the degree of surprise and to challenge the assumptions so that we don't have so much of a shock. There are three elements for us in terms of the neutrality of disruption and really how to kind of minimize its impact. The first one is, what is your perspective? In other words, as we discussed earlier, if you're assuming that the world is stable, linear, and predictable, of course, you'll be shocked every time there's something that is inconsistent with that. But the question is whether your window to the world is wrong or whether the world is different from what it should be. So the perspective you have has a very significant impact as to whether disruption might be good, bad, or what have you. The second element is, how anticipatory is your mindset? In other words, what degree of preparation is being done in advance of a possible or likely event? And we see every day that, for a number of reasons we'll talk about later in the show, with short-termism, with pandemics, with whatever, if we're not anticipating enough, and if we're not initiating and driving the change ourselves that's required as preparation, we don't have the anticipatory mindset, and therefore disruption is likely to be more negative. And the final thing is, what is the nature and timing of any response? So subsequent to any disruption, which might suddenly happen, that can happen, what do you do to respond rapidly as these external changes occur? How do you adapt, and what resilience have you embedded into your company, your business, your life, so that when these shocks do arise, you can kind of manage them? And so for us, the idea of neither good nor bad is really that focus on our agency, which is, what are your perspectives to the world? What is your mindset? And how and when do you respond to change?
That's a great insight. And as a follow-up, you kind of hinted at this, Roger, but I'm wondering if we could delve a little deeper. To what extent does disruption bring, as you point out, massive opportunities for new value creation and novel solutions to, some of the world's greatest challenges? I was hoping you can give us a perspective on that.
Yeah, it's an important one. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all disruption is simply neutral or an opportunity. I'm just saying that it's more layered and nuanced than that. Obviously there is sometimes pure, evil or adverse effects arising from things. But, even with some of the things that can happen in the world, diseases or what have you, there's a constant path of evolution which brings in new ways of resolving diseases or what have you that might not have been imagined possible. So if you take, for instance, healthcare is a good example. When you look at the emergence of the biotech AI platforms, you're really looking at the possibility, of AI. And again, I'm not trying to make a huge fuss of AI. AI has, again, to the neutrality of change, positives, negatives, unexpected consequences. But one of the things for sure that AI can do is accelerate drug discovery, because it's able to perform, literally infinite simulations and developments. And that reduces, life cycles and the cost of R&D testing. So, companies like in Silico or Exentia, today, there are dozens of these, AI engines, which are going through a process of drug discovery, and Google's DeepMind is also focused very much on breakthrough work in predicting protein structures, which accelerate the path to drug discovery. And this is not, just kind of wishful thinking. Today, AI has discovered antibiotics. I think it was MIT researchers which used an algorithms to find molecules which could help treat antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains. And I think one of the medications, there was a non-human made medication which has entered kind of clinical trials, the DSP 1181. But the point is that if you're looking at traditional pharma, drug discovery can take up to 5 years. And if you're looking at what these biotech AI platforms, you can reduce that cycle to potentially 1 year. And that has a significant impact on the world. Disease is really terrible. And if there's a way of curing it, or curing it quicker or better, that's a huge positive thing. And that comes from thinking differently around, biology. And then, you can take the environment. You can consider that sustainable is the new digital. You can look at, what we call greenessence, the renaissance through green and the energy transition. And this is trillions of dollars, which will shift in value and business models for those who are able to scale. I'm not talking about, quick VC turnarounds for point solutions and random technology. I'm talking about, for those who master the right technologies with a systemic perspective that can scale in the real complex world. These are very significant opportunities for value creation. So the list can carry on quite a lot. There's alternative protein versus dairy or meat. Again, to the neutrality, a lot of companies are developing that. It's helpful for the planet, for some of them. And of course, if you're a farmer in Brazil and own cattle, it's less welcome. So this touches upon both the duality and the opportunity for examples of value creation.
Very interesting. So what are the constants and drivers of disruption?
So we cluster them in 5. And before I do that, I'm going to just mention why we treat constant and drivers together. And it's partly to do with thinking about life from maybe a Zen Buddhist or Eastern philosophy. If you take Mujo in Japanese, it means impermanence. And we accept that everything and everyone is constantly changing, which ties in with our idea of disruption being a constant. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus, no one man ever steps in the same river twice. It's not the same river, for it's not the same man. So this idea of permanence and impermanence and change and constant is an interesting one philosophically to think about. Even people like Hermann Hesse in Siddhartha and all that. So the link we'll make with the constants and the drivers is actually helpful, because if you think of an onion and you're trying to peel what's disruptive, what's certain, what's uncertain, paradoxically you can get a better handle of what to sort of prepare for and anticipate. The 5 clusters of what we call the drivers of disruption are the following. One is new change, and that's basically a combination of, we won't go into them in detail, but, Moore's law, Metcalfe's law, the network effect, the laws of accelerating return, certain technologies, the way they can combine and be cumulative and converge, which makes them self-reinforcing. And we're seeing that in AI a lot. So that combination of factors is creating a new type of change, as these are really self-reinforcing in particular. The second driver of disruption we call the hyper premium on relevancy. And actually, we use the analogy of the Red Queen race from Lewis Carroll, the sister book to Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, where the queen is speaking to Alice and she says, well, my dear Alice, you're lucky. Where I come from, it takes all the running, or twice the running, to stay in the same place. So the idea here is, like it or not, there's a hyper premium on being relevant, whether it's competing with machine, whether it's the democratization of knowledge, whether it's microcycles or the end of trends, whether it's hyperconnectivity and reduced barriers. And again, to the neutrality, some of these are positive. If you're a 17-year-old girl in the south of India and you have a smartphone for $30, you can probably get pretty much as much information as a Stanford professor. And again, the reduced barriers to entry mean that, an established company or person can be disrupted very quickly. Likewise, a smaller idea or company or technology can become pervasive quickly. So it plays to the duality. So we have new change. We have the hyper premium on relevancy. The third disruption driver we call irreversibility. And we're going to talk about this in a second. But the main feature and consideration with irreversibility is as the name indicates, you can reach certain milestones where it becomes impossible or very difficult to reverse. So in that category, we talk about climate, technology, and AI. If you can no longer live on planet Earth, you can choose to do a number of things that might be a little bit too late. So it's that element of irreversibility which is fundamental. The fourth driver of disruption is systemic paradigm shifts on society, on information, and complexity. The world is more complex. That has a number of features we can touch upon a bit later. But those systemic paradigm shifts are a major driver of disruption for us. And the final one is rapidly approaching new eras. And in that, we have new frontiers, whether it's space, global reshuffling, whether it's the possibility of China becoming number one, the splinternet, and the world dividing. And then in that rapidly approaching new eras, we also have quantum and artificial life. What are the implications of quantum physics or discoveries? What if you can create inorganic life in, really real artificial life? And so those for us are really the way we frame the drivers of disruption: new change, hyper-premium relevancy, irreversibility, systemic paradigm shifts, and these rapidly approaching new eras. We're not there yet, but the writing is on the wall. And the final point on this topic is why the link between disruptions and constants, and the analogy with impermanence or the Heraclitus, no man ever steps in the same river twice, is because if change is a constant, what's the difference between change and constants? If impermanence is permanent, what's permanent or impermanent? It's kind of linked. If you know that information is decision making, disruption is information, but decision making being driven by these things is a constant, and complexity or decentralization or climate risk with renaissance. So that's where one can try and kind of have a frame where we understand that disruption is a constant. And again, depending on your assumptions of the world, how you prepare for it and respond.
That's a great point. And in that you reference the fact, which I thought was very, very interesting, that advice from so-called experts is becoming less important, helpful, and correct. And instead, in your work that you recently put out, you offer unvice. Would you explain what you mean by this? And what is the new language one should learn in order to thrive in the unvice environment?
Yeah, so it feels like just another unnecessary acronym because the world has too many acronyms already. And there's a risk of the acronym police, getting onto us. So we take that risk, but we do it with a deep conviction, which is the new language is one really, it's a language of a understanding and appreciating uncertainty, really. And the idea is the following. In a complex world, basically, at that point of complexity, there are multiple drivers of change, and there are unknown unknowns. You can't necessarily establish right answers, and you can't necessarily beforehand know the cause and effect of something. So you need to do trial and error. You need to develop some degree of sense making and emergent behavior. And that is different from something which is complicated, where there are known unknowns, where you have experts, you can rely on science, you know how to send a probe to Mars, you know how to fix an engine, you know how to launch a satellite, etc. And it's not that we're anti-science. We very much believe in science, and we very much believe and respect in experts. It's just understanding that a lot of the world is complex, and therefore these are unpredictable situations with unknown unknowns. What does that mean? It means we need constant adaptation and emergence. It means we need beginner's mind, shoshin, to use the Japanese. And therefore, we came up with the acronym ANVICE as an alternative to VUCA. VUCA is about 50 years old. It describes the environment which the US military, the DoD at the time, considered to be the operating environment of military operations or geopolitically. VUCA is V for volatile, U for uncertain, C for complex, and A for ambiguous. The reason we decided to come up with ANVICE is for three reasons. And well, let me first mention what unwise is, and then mention the three reasons. The UN for unwise is unknown. So that, in a sense, is a combination of uncertain and ambiguous. It's unknown. We don't necessarily know everything. It's volatile, so that's the same as a VUCA. We then add I for intersecting, because today we find that boundaries are disappearing, and it's the combinations, the overlaps, the convergence that creates change and also opportunity. It's the intersection of new fields that creates innovation, that creates drug discovery. So we recognize and respect that everything connects to everything else. And that I for intersecting, we feel, is very, very important. C is complex and E is exponential. VUCA, maybe the world was less connected at the time, maybe things were changing less quickly, technology was less mature. We feel that we can't ignore the speed, trajectory, velocity of change. And so we have to pay attention to the rates of change and expect the possible explosions which go with exponential profiles. So our advice is really VUCA, but acknowledging the importance of how things intersect and how that creates change and cascades, and exponential to respect the speed and velocity of change. And why our advice? It's because in our complex world, we have to use and rely as much as possible on experts and science, but we have to acknowledge that we don't know everything, that science doesn't know everything, and they are unknown unknowns. And more, we have to be empowered with the agency to emerge, to discover, and also to rely more on ourselves than we might otherwise have.
So, Roger, what mindset is better suited to thrive in the realities of continuous, rapid, and unpredictable change? And more importantly, how can we widen, deepen the aperture to shift mindsets and change narrative structure around how we perceive uncertainty?
Yeah, those are really essential questions to my mind. And thanks for asking it, because it really deals with in a way, the choices we have and the agency we have around how change affects us. And that's why in a way, disruption is subjective. The more anticipatory your mindset, the deeper your critical set thinking, the more diverse perspectives as to how things might connect, the more you're thinking about the next order implications of things rather than taking the first level things at face value, probably the less astonishment you'll experience from change accelerating. So in that respect, I guess there are two or three things that can be done. I think one is really acknowledging the nature of change is very broad, which is, again, why we talk about systemic disruption, why we want to acknowledge that there are multiple drivers of change, that they constantly evolve, that the next order implications of this change make the change itself evolve. And that will come from, different drivers of disruption we talked about earlier, but they include technology, social dynamics, environmental conditions, and many other things. Some will be the ones that are driven intentionally by ourselves or others, and some might be purely unexpected and external. So if you then have a mindset where you're consistently focused on a broader systems level shifts, if you're thinking of longer time scales and not taking the sort of initial change at face value or in an isolated, discrete way, and you're trying to connect the dots, you'll probably be better prepared. And imagination helps a lot with that. If you think about science fiction or areas which allow you to think, more broadly or more imaginatively, I personally believe that the futures field and foresight strategy is helpful as well. And within those subsets of, systems thinking and complexity, because there you're understanding the systemic levels, you're understanding how things might connect more broadly. And then even philosophy, I think, helps. Eastern philosophy we talked about. You might view change differently if you accept that change is a constant, if you think of transience, or existential philosophy, when you sort of think you have the agency to get comfortable with uncertainty and to deal with it. So to my mind, those are elements of mindsets which I think can not only help you deal with change, but actually, find satisfaction or comfort with change.
That's great. And great transition to learning more about yourself, Roger. I'm wondering, could you tell us more about your career path yourself? What piqued your interest in this? And also maybe touch on the history and mission of the Disruptive Futures Institute. What prompted its creation and how does it fulfill its mission?
Sure. I started my career as an investment banker, so quite a conventional career path. And with that, I was focused on mergers and acquisitions. So I advised CEOs, boards, shareholders globally on mergers and acquisitions, on their strategic partnerships, investments, and that. It's strategic. You're looking to the future. You're looking at change and disruption. I was based in London for many years, and I enjoyed that. I did that for pretty much 20 years, and I was focused on technology, so quite a lot of change and interesting developments. 6 years ago, I moved to San Francisco to lead and set up the M&A team here. And I promised myself when I hit the US and in particular this part of the world to spend more time in different ecosystems. So I spent time at the Center for Institute for Complexity and Systems Thinking. I spent time at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto and other places to think and study more formally, Foresight and Futures. And I did courses at MIT on AI, spent time at the D School and at Stanford on design thinking and innovation. And I really found over a few years that that's really where my interest lied. It was something which was more maybe impactful, maybe more systemic, broader and longer time horizons than just thinking on a transaction by transaction basis. What I thought for much of my career that I was doing the most important thing in the world and the most strategic thing in the world, suddenly a bit more recently, I felt that lens was maybe slightly reduced. So I felt Futures and Foresight was a good umbrella to think about these topics. And I decided 3 years ago to spend time writing a book and take on a few board positions, investing in certain companies, etc. And then the pandemic hit. And the topics I was focusing on, which might have seemed a little bit esoteric or cute or niche or random to some, suddenly it became the biggest problem for the entire world, right? How do you think about unpredictability, uncertainty? How do you make decisions despite that? And that threw all the assumptions we made about the world in a spanner. And I observed 3 or 4 key truths, or I call them truths anyway, in relation to the pandemic. And it's not necessarily that the pandemic caused it, but it really was a catalyst for me. One is that, society and humanity is not that prepared to understand important aspects of what is the real nature of the complex world. 2 is the velocity of the change and systemic transformations are accelerating and are probably going to cascade, into greater changes going forward. It's a constant process. The third element, and this one is terrible and why I spend a lot of time doing what I'm doing, is that both public and private institutions, whether it's governments, agencies, the education systems, many of the world leaders that are meant to kind of protect or at least guide us are pretty much ineffectual when these things happen. And so the pandemic didn't create the unpredictable world, but for me, it set off a chain of events. And I sort of suddenly got really an awareness as to, 1, how important and relevant these topics were, and 2, how lost and misaligned the world and its systems were. And so that's effectively when I decided to set up more formally the Disruptive Futures Institute. And instead of focusing just on books and work for companies, to really think more systemically in terms of institutions, agencies, individuals, and really think systemically as to what is needed to help the world understand better the real nature of our environment, and how to stay relevant and resilient in the face of change.
So that's why you created the Institute? Is that one of the things that set the Institute apart?
It is. I always had in mind to have a Foresight practice, which is Techistential, more focused on, clients and not necessarily educational, more like a practice or consultancy, Foresight practice. And I was always interested in writing books. But in my mind, if you'd asked me the question 5 years ago, those books would have been directed at entrepreneurs or technologists or VCs or corporates. The trigger with the pandemic, it was a validation of my concerns that there is a lot of change, that it is not understood, and that the systems are not really adapted to deal with this change. And that's where I sort of thought, actually, this is a real important topic for a lot of people and a lot of different perspectives. And I would try through the Institute, in terms of an educational platform, in terms of content, in terms of many things that are also free on social media, of just trying to help the world understand better the true nature of change, what to do to prepare for it, and especially that we have agency to not turn it into a big, scary monster.
Mm-hmm. That's a great transition to, you pull together as part of that educational effort, the Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption, a collection in 4 volumes. I was hoping you could tell us more about the series and give us a sense of the effort that went into developing each of these volumes, and what do you want to accomplish with these guides?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It kind of happened in a funny way. I initially set out to write a book which was focused on maybe the 2.0 to 2.5 disruption, as opposed to purely systemic, which we started the conversation with around 3.0. And as the different events unfolded with the world in terms of the pandemic, the geopolitical issues, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and many other things, it became evident that these topics were very interesting to a lot of people. I started getting a lot of demand for talks, for half-day programs, for building courses, for executive education. And so for the past few years, we've been developing those and delivering them, but very focused on, a specific client wants a talk or an executive program. We develop, a 15-hour program on whatever, decision-making and uncertainty and what have you. As we were doing that, we were building basically full-fledged educational programs. And then a lot of people were interested also from a personal perspective. When you're looking at boards and companies, at the end of the day, behind that, they're individuals who also have their own existential questions. And so at some point about a year and a half ago, I thought it made sense to actually structure those executive programs and courses in a guidebook and to share them with the world. And if no one's interested, that's fine. And if people are interested, it's available. And so we thought that there was enough material and content that it made sense to think about a volume 1, which is the foundations. How do you reframe and navigate disruption? How do you make sense of a complex, nonlinear, and unpredictable world? The second volume is fine. We kind of get the foundations. What are the frameworks? What are the essential frameworks for disruption and uncertainty? What practical frameworks can help you or your business stay relevant in the 21st century? And then we felt that a lot of demand was really individuals wanting to just think about their lives. And so we put together in the volume 3, we curated elements which are very focused on your life, beta your life. What is existence in a disruptive world? What does constant change and uncertainty mean to you as an individual? From work to money, to longevity, to education, to the creator economy, all those kind of individual-centric topics. And the final one is a business, disruption as a springboard to value creation. What does the unpredictable, complex, and systemic world mean for you as a business? They're meant to be self-contained, so people can take, just one volume, or they can even hopefully look at a particular chapter or a particular page from A to Z, or from front to back or back to front. We feel, or we hope, that it's certainly been designed to be self-contained in any way that anyone feels it's useful to do so.
What tools, frameworks, and insights can help leaders turn uncertainty into opportunity? We'll explore this question and so much more when the special edition of the Business of Government Hour returns. Welcome back to a special edition of the Business of Government Hour. Leaders speak on thriving on disruption with Roger Spitz, author of The Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption, a collection of 4 volumes. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. I want to transition a little bit and get into the heart of some of the topics you're dealing with. And, you point out while AI, artificial intelligence, the capabilities associated with it are narrow today, multiplying algorithms are rapidly broadening their scope, and AI systems are already automating decision making at scale. And I was wondering, as we delegate decision making to machines, what kind of decisions will we rely on algorithms for, and what will be the consequences? And where I'm going with this, Roger, is how does this connect to the concept of application of tech essentialism, and to what extent are we more influenced by technology and its impact in curtailing our human agency?
Yeah. So to your point, that really starts digging into the core, right? Because the implications on humans and in particular decision making is, to me, one of the most profound elements of needing to think about technology. And that's one of the reasons in our drivers of disruption in irreversibility, we separate technology from AI. It's precisely because through AI, humans no longer have decision-making exclusivity. So the play with techistentialism, as you would have gathered, is really adding technology to existentialism. So in the 20th or the 19th century, when you had Jean-Paul Sartre and Kierkegaard thinking about existentialism as a humanism, human decisions were exclusive to humans. So the existential condition was effectively, what is it to be human in the world? What is our freedom, agency, and choice as humans in the world? Tech essentialism for us is basically existentialism 2.0, existentialism in the 21st century. The impact and the duality of human and algorithmic decision-making. So you're looking at not just an existential condition, but an existential and a technological condition, which is what is existence in our technological world. And the main point and the main implication of automating decision-making at scale is really that if technology is determining outcomes on our behalf, it's curtailing humanity's choice of different possible outcomes. So it really interferes with this idea of contingency, which is driven by our choices and actions, where our freedom as individual are contingent. And so what I find today is that we're seeking to embody or replicate human abilities in machines, as opposed to really rethinking our educational systems, rethinking how we view the world, rethinking how leaders are trained. And we should be relying on expanding and extending our natural human abilities, because to the discussion earlier with the difference between complicated and complex, the more complex the world, that is where humans should be very strong. We're emergent, trial and error. We can make sense of the world in a way that isn't the same cause and effect, where data is strong in a more complicated scenario. So for me, the fundamentals go beyond the normal essential questions around ethics and safeguards and technology, to also thinking about what is humanity doing to develop better decision-making and better capabilities in our complex, unpredictable world.
That's terrific. The next area I want to really focus on, it kind of delves a little deeper, and that is how close are we, Roger, to really sort of inadvertently slipping irreversibly into our worst nightmare. Where I'm going with this is the integration of technology in almost every facet of our lives. And, what's the tipping point? What will tip us in this direction? And I'm wondering, what are the potential unintended consequences of the technology or innovation we're contemplating right now? So basically, when are we going to slip into irreversibility, and what are those tipping point areas that could trigger that?
Yeah, so it's the irreversibility is key, and with that the tipping point and the inflection point. So I like how you framed it, and indeed that's how we approach that. And I think that maybe starting with what we mean by irreversible, the first element of irreversibility is that there's possible damage. In other words, that there are adverse consequences which can be very damaging, even if a particular technology or innovation holds the benefits that it's meant to. So that's the element of possible damage. Okay, so it's that duality. You can have something that is deriving benefits and positive stuff or outcomes while still causing possible damage. The second thing is, and a simple example is, developments in AI for drug discovery are making AI develop further capabilities. Those capabilities, when deployed on drug discovery, most likely they, hopefully be positive. But at the same time, where do you stop those capabilities of machine learning, of neural networks, for other things that may not be just as focused or as beneficial as drug discovery? So anyway, the first element is, of a reversibility, there's a possible damage. The second element is there's a potential tipping point. So there's a threshold whereby it might at that point become irreversible, that particular development. And the third element is that it's difficult to reverse it. So that goes with the kind of irreversibility. It can be very difficult or very expensive or profound or impossible to reverse the implications once they start manifesting. So that's where we need to start thinking about, you can't just monitor and wait for things to manifest, because the whole point with the difficulty in reversing is that those might be difficult to reverse once they manifest themselves. So examples of these are, they're hundreds probably, but one good example is gene editing, for instance, for all the wonders that could potentially go with gene editing, blood disorders, treating blindness, muscular dystrophy, or many other, conditions. Some of the aspects of gene editing could involve, nano scissors or ways where you're manipulating genes, where you're making some edits, which can result in either unpredictable outcomes or where there's a point of no return, where, whatever changes you're making continue for many generations, and you can't change those future genomes by virtue of having made that initial change. And so that's kind of the framing. Now, the very important point, and I'm glad you framed it like that, with a tipping point, and to understand really that aspect is, you often hear change is slow, but I always talk about change is slow until it isn't. The issue with the exponential, and why we added the E of exponential to VUCA, to get advice, is because of that point where you may suddenly get a tipping point. And there are many elements which can drive something to an inflection point. And, I won't talk about it now. It's a longer discussion. But what I would say is that humans are bad at nonlinear. We're not cabled to appreciate exponential. We tend to basically not notice it until it's too late. Think about the pandemic. And so the problem with irreversibility is that element where if you suddenly reach a tipping point, an inflection point, and you have an exponential profile, it might be too late. In addition to that, I think one of the things that makes it difficult to perceive and to anticipate change is Amara's law. People overestimate initially the hype from a technology. So you get bored, you get blasé, but you tend to underestimate the longer term impact. So if you look at exponential, where you don't notice the change early on and you pretty much ignore it, and if you do notice it, there's a huge amount of overhype because of Amara's noise, take AI, metaverse, whatever you want. The combination of those two is what we call the inflection paradox, which is, not only are we not good at detecting exponential profiles, but we kind of might even ignore what we should be spotting because of the effect of Amara's law. So that's basically our spin on it.
Well, that's a good spin. You mentioned earlier, Roger, the concept of foresight in the previous segment. I was wondering if we can talk about the foresight as relates to technology. What is technology foresight? What are the dimensions to consider in relation to unintended consequences of really ever-evolving technological advancement? And what is the difference, more importantly, between consequences which can be anticipated versus those which are unavoidable?
Yeah. So technology foresight is I don't know if there's an official definition of it. We basically use it in the sense of, what are the kind of cognitive or mental tools that can be used to consider the future of a technology and the impact it might have on society and its environment. And why we sort of separated from general foresight is due to the stakes, the scale, the sophistication, and the irreversible nature of technology we talked about. It's a very specific animal. Now, candidly, technology foresight should be a tautology, because given the features of technology, everybody should really be thinking long and hard as to how to anticipate, monitor, and mitigate potential, impacts and next order implications of technology. But it's not always the case. And I'd say there's a subset of technology foresight, which might be, if and how one's able to anticipate governance structures and governance of how technologies might evolve. And there's a big debate around that, especially from technologists, as to how do you, prescribe something without knowing what you're prescribing, because it's precisely unpredictable to a degree. So that's where we bring in 2-3 elements to answer your question, which is we feel that basically you should anticipate, then monitor, and then mitigate. So anticipate is you try to imagine what, to your point, can you anticipate as consequences versus what might just arise. And so we try and think hard about unanticipated consequences, which are effects which maybe we could have anticipated and avoided, versus unintended, which arguably might be unavoidable. So if you're looking at, different possible unintended consequences, there's a lot that technology does, right? From the environment to the climate, to gender, race, income inequality, to disinformation or misinformation, privacy, ethics, bias. So there's a lot going on. And really, in the way those are analyzed, one should kind of think about unanticipated. You should be debiasing databases because they're biased. You should be thinking about constantly monitoring with feedback loops because that there'll be things that arise. So you need the right monitoring and the feedback loops. You need accountability. You need independence. You need to understand how inflection points work. You need to understand the irreversibility, systemic approach to the monitoring, because you can't look at point solutions. So these are all things in the monitoring which acknowledge and bring you towards really thinking more hard of what should be anticipated versus simply saying, well, who knows? You can't cover everything. And the final thing is mitigating. Basically, the more you anticipate, the better you monitor with accountability, independence, with the understanding the reversibility and a systemic approach. The more you monitor with that, basically, the more effective any mitigation is likely to be. So that's how we frame it.
Great framing. And, I want to jump right to the implications of AI. And specifically, Roger, your work has an interesting aspect to it around the geopolitics and AI shaping world order. What are the implications of AI on a geopolitical level? And what can you tell us about the geopolitical race for what has been coined the AI supremacy?
Yeah. So the stakes with AI, I think, are well known by probably most people and your listeners, but just to cover them quickly, there's an element which is job displacement, automation. There's an element which is what is AI? Could you think about it as a dystopia or utopia? What is the road? Are we somewhere in the middle? Are we on the Black Mirror scenario? Or are we sort of, the wonders of AI will fix everything? The decision making, what are the degrees of intelligence, and the singularity question, and the super intelligence. So there's a question of that evolution of AI in decision making, and then how can AI harm society? So those are some of the dimensions, and within that, there's an additional one, which is the race to AI supremacy, which you mentioned. And here, listen, it's a tricky one. What I would say is just 2 or 3 elements. I think first of all, of course, the world needs to, be very thoughtful in terms of safety and ethics and, appropriateness and protection of technology and AI in particular. We also need to acknowledge that basically, if a particular government regulates in a particular way around AI or any type of research, it doesn't mean that will happen equally in the entire world. And basically, what's happening today is that, the US and a lot of the big companies are rightly being very concerned with dual use technology and facial recognition. And that's, no doubt about how important and probably essential that is. when you think about AI supremacy race, you then acknowledge that, China has an ambition to become the world leader in AI by 2030. It probably already has more AI-related, patents by academic institutions that are filed in the US. It has basically 1.5 billion people to train AI on. It doesn't necessarily have the same safeguards and concerns around the dual use. And when you put all that together, basically, the AI supremacy race could be a situation where certain countries or regions, or China, not to name them, are way ahead in terms of the US. Now, again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it means that you should just allow anything in any particular way. And the US has great initiatives, not least the Chips and Science Act. These are hundreds of billions of dollars of support. But when you see how Europe regulates AI, again, very appropriate way of managing society and the impacts of technology. No debate about that. When you see the sort of concern around, the US and privacy, again, these are very, very important. It's just acknowledging the fact that those regions that are doing things differently and playing by different rules will achieve different outcomes in terms of that potential race.
So, you mentioned a concept, sort of a neologism, if you will, called Info-Ruption. What is that, and how may it lead to disastrous consequences for society? And what are the related, I'm wondering, when you think of information, what are the related cybersecurity implications of these types of and forms of disruption?
Yeah, indeed. We play with Info-Ruption because it's kind of like disruption is the theme of the book. But as we mentioned earlier, we do feel that one of the important systemic paradigm shifts in our drivers of disruption is information. And so Info-Ruption is really information and that's being disrupted. And that's a pervasive and radical change in the way data dynamics cascade and how information is interpreted, used, and in particular misused. So that's fundamentally what it is. There's a lot that can be said, and now is probably not the time to spend too long on that specific point. I think these points are well covered around the impact of misinformation and disinformation on alternate realities and polarization and democracy, and we can spend a lot of time talking about that. And a lot of this, is not by accident. There are bad agents out there and puppeteers for whom it's their interest to have a very polarized and weakened democracy. So that's a separate broad discussion, but effectively that's what Info-Ruption touches upon. In relation to the subset of cybersecurity as a systemic risk, and that to a degree is also part of a subset of information being disrupted, here you have many aspects to it. The ones that are well known are, of course, the cyber attacks. So cybersecurity is often deemed synonymous with cyber threats and cyber attacks. But, you could have extended internet and infrastructure blackouts. You could have the financial systems that are mobilized or immobilized. You could have humans that are harmed by targeting critical assets or hospitals, with a world that's more connected as ever. So when you have the capabilities with AI and other technology that we talked about, and when certain regions or bad actors are developing those faster, we need to be very mindful as to whether we understand the capabilities of this, whether we understand the implications, and whether we can build resiliency in our systems and structures to ensure that basically, those attacked aren't just ransomware for $200 million, but that actually you suddenly end up launching nuclear missile towards France because someone got into the system, or because there's no electricity in the US because there are continuous blackouts, or there's no communication and no one can move anymore because the internet there's a blackout that's lasting a long time, or hospitals are shut and healthcare systems are accessed. So the ramifications as part of understanding systemic disruption are quite broad. And again, you can't look at it just as this kind of narrow, cyber attack or cyber threat. This is really a systemic risk.
How do we rise above resiliency or adaptability to actually thrive on disruption? We'll explore this question and so much more when a special edition of the Business of Government Hour returns. Welcome back to a special edition of the Business of Government Hour. Leaders Speak on Thriving on Disruption with Roger Spitz, author of The Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption, a collection of 4 volumes. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. I want to move on, Roger, and talk about some of the practical tools and applications you have in your series. And the one I'd like to speak of is around the AAA Framework, if we could. What qualities and characteristics should we be developing to improve our abilities as the world becomes ever more complex and unpredictable? And then where I'm going with this is, what's the best way for us to understand and use that framework that you outline in your book?
Yeah. So listen, it's like all acronyms, right? It's just behind it, there's language and amazing ideas from many other, from other bright minds. But fundamentally, it's the following. We feel that for resiliency, it's important to have the right foundations, and that's anti-fragile. So we borrow anti-fragile from Nassim Taleb, from his Inserto series of 5 books, and in particular the one called, Anti-Fragile. And the idea is really that not only are you resilient to shocks, but that you strengthen with shocks. So here it's really calling upon innovation, tinkering, heuristic processes, understanding it's basically adapted to complex systems. It likes errors. It likes to thrive in randomness. It allows optionality. And so if you have those right foundations, whatever might arise, you're probably going to be more resilient or even better benefit from it. The next A is anticipatory. And here it's really using the term in the futures and foresight field. It's really thinking about the capacity to prepare for change and for any or many possible futures. So here you're interpreting weak signals, you're looking at next order implications, you're deciphering the patterns if you can. You're really thinking about that analysis between what is known knowns versus unknown knowns versus known unknowns and unknown unknowns. So it's really, you're preparing for all possibilities and doing that in a way to avoid surprises, but also on the positive side to detect opportunities. And the final one is A for agility. And so we have anti-fragile, anticipatory, and agility. Now, agility is a word which is used a huge amount in all kinds of different contexts. We use it as the agility to bridge short-term with the long-term. In other words, in anticipatory, you've thought about different scenarios, you've thought about maybe longer time horizons, next-order implications. But in the end, the present exists, and you need to, in the here and now, make sense of the world, experiment, amplify what's working, dampen what's not. You need to emerge in this complex world with the right feedback loops. And that agility is really what allows you to emerge in the present, but not firefighting and just forgetting your longer term strategy. It's really constantly bridging your vision with the here and now.
That's great. So, in terms of getting vision, when you mentioned vision in the here and now, I just think of sometimes organizations, effort around strategic planning. And I'm wondering, systemic disruption creates limitations to relying on strategic planning. And I was hoping you could highlight some of those limitations.
Yeah, that's really key. And that's kind of the reverse of the coin of, the AAA and why I kind of fell in love and kind of moved to thinking more systemically and to moving away from the more corporate strategic kind of approach of my day to day. And spend a huge amount of time thinking about these topics. So a few of the limitations in our mind for strategic planning. One is that often you're looking for an answer instead of asking a broad set of questions and imagining a broad set of possibilities. So you're really thinking about a particular outcome and think about, how do I get there? The second thing is maybe ignoring the domino or the ripple effects of the assumptions that are made. So you make a few assumptions, which is often going to give you a singular focus or a fixed outcome. And then what happens to those assumptions and to the reliance on those assumptions over time if they're wrong? A great example is take the Fed and inflation in the US. I mean, they probably have the best economists, the best models, the best data in the world. And they were like, oh, yeah, sorry, we got caught short and we sort of thought we could control it and it was fine. But sorry, we have 10% inflation. And and then what are the implications and the domino effects of that? So it's really just, understanding the systemic nature and the amplified domino cascades of wrong assumptions if you're relying on them. There's a piece we talked about earlier, which I think is a major limitation to relying on strategic planning, which is linked to those ripple effects of assumptions, which is the increasing cost of relying on a business as usual because of the inverse relationship between predictability and uncertainty. So the more uncertain, the less predictable. So if you're relying on a strategic plan, well, guess what? That's problematic. There's a piece which is related to the E for exponential from our unvice, right? Change is slow until it isn't. So again, if you're missing the inflection points, if you're missing the cascades, whether they're good or bad, that has ramifications. So in our view, strategic planning is really constantly seeking certainty by overemphasizing trend analysis, by trying to quantify the unquantifiable. You can quantify and have the biggest spreadsheet in the world. It doesn't make the unquantifiable quantified. So that acknowledgement that we're in a complex area that is unknown unknowns is really essential. And so the fundamental aspect to it, just to wrap up on that question, is that there's no substitute for being prepared and for building, the right muscles for resilience, rather than relying on a strategic plan effectively.
Got a couple of more questions for you, Roger. So, disruption, as we talked about, is certain and omnipresent, but you point out, right, whether you like it or not, it creates more agency and possibilities, and maintaining relevance requires, constantly reframing, ideating, and prototyping and testing our choices in regards to the constant disruption we're dealing with. And so I was wondering, how do we rise above resilience and adaptability to thrive in disruption? And can you tell us more about the 6 I's concept that you outline in your book that helps us understand the language of disruption?
Yeah, it's an aspect we tried to not take too lightly, because the risk is, there are a lot of books out there about how to think about the future and be anticipatory, or how to be disruptive. And we really wanted to take an existential and a human step back as well, which is beyond all the things we've talked about. Actually, we should thrive on disruption. At an existential level, the reason is that if everything was predictable and certain, we would have no freedom, agency, and choice. So the reality is that why we are able to thrive on disruption is precisely because disruption is a constant, and it allows us to create whatever we want of ourselves and the world. And so when we thought about the ingredients to that, we boiled it down to what we call the 6 I's, which is, if you have intuition and develop it, you avoid preconceptions, you trust yourself, you trust your judgment, that is helpful. If you're inspired, you explore, you're curious, you're imaginative, you ask broad questions, you break from the present. If you're prepared to improvise, you experiment, you make mistakes, but mistakes are gifts, you accept the ambiguity. If you think that nothing is predetermined, you invent your future. That's the invention. And then you have confidence to wander, to fail, and maybe you'll stumble upon the impossible, and you believe you can achieve the impossible. So the 6 I's for us, which are intuition, inspiration, imagination, improvisation, invention, impossible, it's really what allows you to have that beginner's mind, to be curious, to accept failures, to be passionate, to use your agency, and to really think about the world of change in a way that's not necessarily negative, because there's a lot of positive things which come with those features of being, imaginative and inspired and intuitive, etc.
Well, my last question for you, Roger, is around maybe giving some advice. And where I'm going with this is, how can your work help government executives more effectively lead in an era where uncertainty and disruption seem to be the only and singular constants?
Yeah, that's really one of the things I'm trying to achieve, which is why I didn't want to just write books for business people, because ultimately, if you don't address it systemically, including policymakers, including government, including all kinds of different things, it's potentially wasted. So listen, there are different ways, but I would say to kind of keep it as a brief wrap up. One is government foresight. Okay, there's certain countries which are very good, which have been doing it for decades. Singapore, Canada, some of the Scandinavian countries. Finland even has a committee for the future and a government foresight group, which is responsible and part of the Prime Minister's office, and they are tasked to think about things in terms of decades ahead, not just the lifetime of their mandate or their particular political life. They are basically looking at next order implications of change. They are looking at things systemically. So systemically, it really means addressing the endemic short-termism, which comes with a lot of public policy. So for instance, if you think about the levers for change in a systemic world, how do you change the mental models? That comes with education, and, public policy and governments and the agencies have an influence on education. The way you look at the world and see the world and the assumptions you made of education have a big impact on how resilient society will be. The structures, how you're regulating, what governance are you putting in place, what incentives to achieve a particular outcome. We know that incentives determine outcomes. And then how do we monitor what's happening, the patterns and the trends? What is the disclosure? What is being communicated? So not all of these are led by public policy or governments, but ultimately many of these are. And so once you start realizing that you're not looking at quick fixes or point solutions, but look at systemically, that's where you see the very significant role for governments and public policy, beyond just what individuals can do and their family units and sort of the commercial organizations.
Roger, that wonderful advice. And, I want to thank you for coming on today and talking to us about it. I was just wondering if folks are interested, how can they get their hands on your series?
Thanks for asking. So we have a website which is called Thriving on Disruption, which has a lot of resources. They are for sale on Amazon. They're downloadable on Apple Books, on Kindle. By now, given the sort of 2 volumes out and 2 volumes coming out in January and February, most of the time, if you Google Thriving on Disruption, you'll find links that lead you either to the retailers that sell the books or the ebooks, or to our website, which has more information. And follow us also on social media. One of our objectives is to democratize this. So we try and not be too, we probably fail, but we try to not be too complicated in terms of language. We try to have a lot of visuals, and we try to have a lot that's free and available on social media.
It's wonderful. Well, I want to thank you again, and let's come back together down the road.
Very much look forward to that. Likewise, and it was a wonderful honor and a great set of things to think about that you've raised. Thanks so much, Michael.
This has been a special edition of the Business of Government Hour. Leaders Speak on Thriving on Disruption with Roger Spitz, co-author of the Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption and founder of the Disruptive Futures Institute. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at iTunes or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org. For the Business of Government Hour, I'm Michael Keegan, and thanks for joining us.